Hi everyone, I'm here to talk about the study titled Matching Learning Style to Instructional Method and its Effects on Comprehension, which was conducted in 2015. So, before getting into the study itself, I wanted to clarify what exactly learning styles are. Overall, learning styles can be summarized as the idea that there are predetermined ways in which people better understand information and learn, depending on the different formats it's taught to them and how it engages them. Learning styles are often thought to be biologically determined, meaning that our own learning styles are innate ways in which our brain may be geared to better understand information as well as retain it. So the idea of learning styles was first introduced and built upon by various researchers like David Kolb and John Dewey, for example. Each researcher brought their own perspective to the topic, as well as various types of learning styles. However, these ideas were always presented more as theories since no conclusive experimental data was used to support them. If we look at a study from 2019, however, we see that the theory of learning styles is something that many people generally believe in, that we can learn better if information is presented to us in a certain way. For example, if you're an auditory learner, you may benefit more from a spoken lecture than from a hands-on experiment. However, there's actually been very little research about learning styles, and that is what this study hopes to address. So the general hypothesis for this study relies on the meshing hypothesis. The meshing hypothesis is the idea that people will learn best when they learn in the way that suits their preferred learning method. So if you're a visual learner, you'll most likely learn best from an activity like reading. Similarly, if you're an auditory learner, you may retain details about a book better if you listen to it as an audiobook rather than reading from text. So based on the meshing hypothesis, researchers in this study proposed that the participants' scores would similarly follow this trend, that participants would show higher scores in the formats of the preferred learning methods and score lower in tests that do not. So the goal of the study was to explore this relationship between learning style and comprehension. Two questions were posed for the study. Question 1 is, what is the extent to which learning style preferences equate to learning aptitudes? In other words, do auditory learners perform better in auditory tests, and do visual learners learn better from a test format that also matches their style? Question 2 then asked, essentially, can we use learning styles to predict how well people learn based on the way information is presented to them? In other words, could we use the knowledge of someone's learning style to predict how well they may perform on a test, depending on how that test is given? So, for methods, the study recruited a total of 121 participants from the New York area who fit this list of requirements. If you notice, some of these requirements include having normal hearing and vision, as well as no history of learning impairments, which was a way to exclude other possible confounding variables from the sample population. Other requirements, like age and education level, was to once again try and create a similar sample population. If some participants are more educated than others, they will more likely have higher comprehension scores. These scores would more likely reflect their education level rather than their learning style, however. These participants were then asked to complete a standardized learning style preference inventory. The test that was used in this study came from a study conducted by Rundle and Dunn in 2010. The test was composed of various questions that asked participants to answer questions based on a 5-point scale ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. This was to help determine what learning style a participant prefers. In the study, special attention was given to auditory and visual word elements. This was because researchers were only interested in focusing on auditory and visual word learning styles. Therefore, the 53 participants who classified as neither of these were exempted from the analysis, even if they were still asked to complete the various tests within the study. From the initial sample, this left 37 participants who were classified as auditory learners and 31 as visual word learners. Then, participants were given various comprehension tests to explore their learning, including the verbal comprehension aptitude measure to answer question 1. This was conducted through the Gray oral reading test, which was composed of 4 short passages ranging at around 150 words each. Each of the passages was followed by 5 comprehension questions. Participants took this test in its 2 formats: reading e-text and listening to it as an audiobook. The order of the test formats that were given to each participant was randomized. Afterwards, participants were then randomly assigned to one of 2 groups for the second part of the study, which was to address question 2. For this part, all participants were quizzed on Chapter 17 from the book Unbroken. This passage was a bit longer than those in the previous test, ranging at around 3,200 words. In one group, participants read this chapter via e-text, and the other group listened to it as an audiobook. Afterwards, participants were asked 48 comprehension questions. To answer the question about information retention in learning style, participants were directed to return to the study 2 weeks after their first attempt to take the same test again. So, for the results of question 1, a one-way multivariate analysis of variance, or a MANOVA, was used to examine the effects of the learning style groups on the 2 test scores. From the data collected, they were able to find significant evidence to suggest that one learning group scored better on one of the tests and that one learning style group performed better overall. Researchers then used ANOVAs to get more details on this. They found that the visual word learning style group actually scored higher on the listening test and the visual word test than the auditory group. To better understand this relationship, a multiple linear regression analysis was used, and they found that as preference for auditory learning increased, performance on the listening test actually decreased. The graphs from the study help better represent this relationship. Figure 1a shows a graph that would support the meshing hypothesis. As a refresher, the meshing hypothesis is the theory that people will score higher in tests that are geared more towards their preferred learning style and less on test formats that do not. For example, a visual word learner would score well in a test where they must read a book, but score less when they instead listen to a recording of the same passage. This would be the same but vice versa for auditory learners, hence the inverse relationship represented in Figure 1a. Figure 1b, however, is just one possible example of data that would not support the meshing hypothesis because it does not show the same cross between the 2 learning groups. Finally, at the bottom is the data from question 1 of the study, represented in Figure C. When we compare Figure 1c to the 2 graphs above it, we can see that it more closely resembles Figure 1b, the unacceptable example. This is because the 2 lines do not cross, which would show the inverse relationship of the 2 variables. In other words, we would expect auditory learners to score well on the listening test, but worse on the visual one, and vice versa. However, as we can see, the data in Figure 1c shows visual learners scoring better in both tests. For question 2, a between subjects ANOVA was used to examine the effects of learning style preference to the different versions of the Unbroken test in Attempt 1. They found that, again, visual word learners scored higher than auditory learners. Additional data reveal that the way the test was taken, whether audiobook or e-text, had no strong significance. The relationship between instructional condition and learning style was, again, not significant. This indicates that even when information is taught in a way to match preferred learning style, there is no significant increase in comprehension. This relationship is once again shown in Figures 2a, 2b, and 2c. Figure 2a shows what would be acceptable evidence to support the meshing hypothesis, where we again see the inverse relationship between learning style and test scores according to test method. As usual, we would want to see higher scores in tests that match a participant's preferred learning style and lower scores in tests that do not. Figure 2b is another example of a graph that would not support the meshing hypothesis. Finally, Figure 2c represents the data collected from both versions of the Unbroken passage test, the e-text format and the audiobook format. When we examine the Figure 2c from the study, we can see that it looks most similar to Figure 2b rather than 2a. Like the graph 2b, Figure 2c's data shows a similar meeting point between the 2 lines and a slow convergence away from it. Again, there's no inverse relationship represented here between learning style preference and comprehension level. In other words, we do not see these lines cross. On the contrary, we can see that visual word learners actually scored better on both versions of the test, whether that be the e-text or audiobook formats. So, based on these results, we can make conclusions about the two questions posed at the beginning of the study. Overall, the data failed to support the matching hypothesis in both questions. So for question 1, differences in preferred learning style showed no difference in learning aptitude. This was supported by the evidence gathered from the short passage test participants were given in either e-text or audiobook format. Similarly, in question 2, differences in learning style showed no difference in learning comprehension or information retention. This was supported by the data collected from the second part of the study related to the unbroken chapter, as well as having participants return to complete the test again 2 weeks later. So while learning styles are widely believed to be accurate ways to improve learning and teaching methods, data from this study supports that learning styles may not actually have as strong of an influence on our learning as we may initially have believed. Some of the limitations listed by researchers for the study include the fact that the sample population does not fully represent the general population. Since, for example, participants had to be college educated to be included, these conclusions can only be applied to that population. The researchers also wondered if versions of the tests were easier than others and if that could have led to a difference in the scores. As well, since the participants were separated into even smaller groups, this reduced the sample population size. Generally, larger population sizes provide more reliable and representative data. With that being said, here are the references that I used for this presentation, and thank you for listening.